Hi guys, and welcome back to the basics of programming. So last time I lectured you all on the importance of comments, so hopefully you'll use them in your code from now on. And if you haven't seen that video, do go watch that. You get to hear me ranting on about comments for a good 5 minutes. They're important, I firmly believe this. But today we are going to go into some more details about data types. So we touched on this a little bit over the last few episodes, but today I'm going to actually tell you what I've been talking about. So there's loads of different types of data types, like loads of different ones, and different programming languages treat them differently. But today I'm going to cover the 4 most important ones that are always used in everything. So strings, integers, floats, and boolean. And we've already used strings and integers, so hopefully those two should make sense. But floats and booleans are a little bit more interesting. So a string is something that is like some text. So whether it be one word or a whole paragraph or an essay, that's a string. So if I was, I'm not clicked on it. So if I was to print a string, you do need to put it in these speech marks. But that's what a string is. So if I save and run that, just prints like that. It's a string. Now something interesting you can do with strings is you can add them together, and they do something called concatenate, which is like where they stick together. I'll show you what I mean. So if I have string 1, and it's going to say this is part 1, I'm going to leave a space there, and you'll see why in a minute. String 2. And this is part 2. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to print string 1 plus string 2, if I can spell, and save and run that. And you'll see that they add together just like they were never apart, which is quite cool. So remember that, because you'll find that useful later on. Next thing we're going to talk about are integers. Now you've seen integers a lot. These are just whole numbers, bog standard, what you'd think of as a number. Yeah, they can be massive or very tiny, but they're a whole number. No decimal points at all. That's an integer. Floats. Now, the reason it's called a float is because it's short for floating point number, and that's any number with a decimal point. So something like 2.4 or even like 3.0, like that's technically an integer, but because you've put a 0.0, then it becomes a float. And booleans. So a boolean value is either true or false, and it can only be one of 2 values. It can only be true or false. And these are really useful when it comes to like logic checks and checking to see if something's been completed, which we will come on to in a later episode, because that will come under iteration. But they're very, very useful. And when you type them in Python, and this isn't the same for every programming language, but in Python, you need to capitalize them. So you write them like that, and you'll notice they change color in idle. But if I didn't have the capital, it just wouldn't work. So it has to have a capital in Python. That's not the same for all programming languages though, so don't forget that. Okay, next thing we're going to talk about is called casting. And casting is basically a fancy way of saying that you're changing the data type of a value. So if I was casting something to a string, so I've got a couple of examples. You need to use str and then put in brackets whatever you want to cast. So if I was to cast the number 34 to a string, to be fair, when you run this, it'll probably, yeah, it looks the same as an integer or a string normally would, but that means that you can like compare it to another string, whereas you can't compare a number to a string, but if they're of the same data type, then you can. So that is why it's useful. Integers, if I wanted to cast something to an integer, so if this one's actually quite important, if I wanted to cast 3.7 to an integer, save that and run that, it doesn't round it up or round it down. It just truncates it, so it just cuts off everything after the decimal point. So you would get 3, and if I changed that to like 242 point however many things, that would truncate to 242. So that can be really useful if they've added a whole bunch of decimal points on that are completely irrelevant. But yeah, where that comes in handy, it will become obvious. And next we're going to talk about casting to a float. So, same way, if I was to cast 2 to a float, it would then come out as 2.0. Which, once again, that's useful because if you want to compare an integer to a float, you can't, it's like you can't compare an apple and an orange, but if the orange miraculously turns into an apple, you can compare them. So that's why you need to turn integers to floats. If that kind of makes sense. I know I probably sound like I'm talking crazy, but later on, when we start doing some more interesting stuff, I promise you it will make sense. Now, we can combine strings and other data types when we print things by using a comma. So if I was to do something, let's call this sum, and I want to print the result of this. Now, we know the answer is 4, and if we put answer equals 4, and then if I put print sum comma answer, and this is why I've left the little space, and run that, it'll become 1, which is quite cool. So, yeah. Hopefully that all made sense, besides my random rants about apples and oranges. And you can now start to use those in your code from now on. So next time we will start on something called selection, which is where the real programming will start. Some more interesting stuff happens there. And don't forget to try out the challenges, but that's it for today. I will see you guys next time. Thank you for joining me.